The first time Axis soldiers saw American medics charging into a battlefield, it didn't feel like war as they understood it. It felt like something else, something that defied the rules they'd grown up with. Gunfire still cracked across the fields, the dirt trembled with the percussion of artillery, and through the haze came figures in fatigues marked with white bands and red crosses. They ran toward the bullets, not away from them. For German and Italian infantrymen crouched behind shattered walls, for Japanese troops dug into jungle ravines, the sight was more than strange, it was incomprehensible. These were not stretcher-bearers who waited for the smoke to clear. These men moved through fire as if death itself owed them a ceasefire. One German soldier later recalled how he froze when he first saw it. The firefight in Tunisia had lasted less than 10 minutes. As soon as the shooting stopped, he expected silence, the kind of silence where the wounded are left groaning in the mud until nightfall. Instead, he saw Americans appear in pairs, bending over the fallen before the smoke even cleared. It was as if they'd been hiding under the ground, he said years later. They came so fast. What unsettled the Axis troops most wasn't only speed, it was purpose. American medics moved with the precision of soldiers executing a drill. One cut open a bandage roll with his teeth. Another injected a dose of morphine from a tube clipped to his belt. A third pressed his hand against a wound to stop the bleeding. Within minutes, the injured were being pulled back toward waiting jeeps. It was organized, rehearsed, unnervingly calm. For Axis armies, war had long been governed by a brutal rhythm. If a man fell in the middle of a fight, help would come later, maybe. Stretcher-bearers were often untrained, short on supplies and exposed. Survival depended on luck. The Americans, however, had rewritten the rhythm entirely. They treated medical care not as something that followed war, but as part of the war itself. This difference cut deeper than anyone realized. Axis propaganda had taught soldiers to believe in endurance, in facing wounds with stoicism, in dying where they fell. But when they saw the Americans drag men out of kill zones before the ground cooled, the message was clear. The enemy refused to let its soldiers be taken easily. A Sicilian officer watching from a captured farmhouse described the scene with quiet bitterness. They had two armies, he muttered to a comrade, one with rifles, one with bandages. What made the Red Cross so striking was how openly it was displayed. American medics wore their armbands like flags, trusting that the Geneva Convention would shield them. Axis troops, trained to see exposure as recklessness, could barely believe it. The Americans were staking their survival on an international promise, one not always honored, and yet they advanced anyway. And sometimes they treated not just their own. There were stories whispered among German POW camps, stories that blurred the line between shock and humiliation. A German corporal, shot in the shoulder during the fighting near Kasserine Pass, remembered waking not in a German aid station but in an American tent. His arm was already bandaged, and someone was adjusting a plasma line above him. I didn't understand, he told interrogators. I thought they were mocking me, then I realized they were saving me. Such moments cut against everything Axis troops had been told to believe. To them, the enemy was a machine, efficient, mechanized, ruthless. Yet here they were, injecting morphine into the veins of a man who'd been trying to kill them an hour before. The shock wasn't only emotional, it was strategic. American commanders had designed their battlefield medical response to operate within minutes, not hours. Their medics trained for months, learning to run toward the sound of gunfire, not away from it. They were drilled to read wounds the way soldiers read maps, fast, decisive, clinical. It was a choreography invisible to those outside the system, but terrifyingly clear to those watching it work. Axis soldiers noticed the effect almost immediately. When Americans were hit, they didn't lie in the mud waiting for fate. They were lifted out. Treated, returned to the fight weeks later. Axis wounded, by contrast, were often left to chance. A man who bled on the battlefield was a man already half gone. This realization crept slowly through German ranks. Letters home spoke of it in bitter tones. They don't abandon their wounded like we do, one infantryman wrote. They steal them back from death. The Red Cross became a symbol of something far larger than a medical corps. To Axis troops, it represented an entire philosophy of war, one that valued the life of each soldier as an asset worth fighting for. The medics didn't carry rifles, but they carried a kind of power just as lethal, a power that denied the battlefield its harvest. And that denial terrified their enemies. A Japanese officer captured later in the war admitted his confusion. We were trained to see wounds as a soldier's fate, he said, but they fought against fate. Every new encounter reinforced the same unsettling truth. When a mortar shell struck an American squad, the fight didn't end. The medics moved in, bandages unfurled like white flags in the smoke. Hands pressed into wounds before the echo faded. The enemy was not only killing men, they were fighting a system designed to undo the killing. For the Axis, that realization arrived like a slow-burning fuse. They were used to thinking of strength in terms of tanks, guns, divisions, but the Americans had quietly built something different, a battlefield where death itself had to work harder. By the winter of 1942, Axis soldiers were beginning to realize something they hadn't been trained to expect. American medical care on the battlefield wasn't just an act of mercy, it was a weapon of strategy. The Americans had built their entire combat doctrine around the idea that saving the wounded was not separate from winning the battle, it was part of it. Every medic on the field was as much a piece of the machine as a rifleman or a gunner. The Axis came armed with divisions and artillery. The Americans came with a second, quieter army, one built of stretchers, plasma bottles, and training manuals. A German lieutenant captured near Anzio would later admit, "We thought medical care was something that came after victory. The Americans, they used it to win." The speed that Axis soldiers found so unnerving wasn't improvisation. It was the result of years of deliberate preparation. Before the United States even joined the war, its army had reimagined how wounded men could be pulled from the front. Medics trained not just in bandaging, but in spotting injuries under pressure. They learned to tell the difference between a wound that could be stabilized and one that needed surgery within an hour. They drilled under simulated fire, learned to crawl through wire with plasma kits strapped to their backs, and moved in coordinated pairs, one treating, one watching for danger. To Axis soldiers, accustomed to seeing stretcher bearers as expendable laborers, this was alien. American medics were not afterthoughts, they were integral to the battle plan. And because of that, they moved like soldiers, not like bystanders. Equally unsettling to the Axis was how boldly the Americans displayed their medical insignia. White armbands with red crosses gleamed through the mud. They stood out against olive drab like beacons, deliberate, unmistakable, daring. It was a calculated risk. The U.S. command believed that by clearly identifying medical personnel, they could shield them under international convention, but there was more to it than legality. That visible cross was a psychological weapon. It signaled to American soldiers that help was always near, and to the enemy that the wounded here would not be left behind. Some Axis soldiers respected the symbol, others ignored it, but all noticed the effect. The medics did not hide. They walked and ran with purpose, carrying bags heavier than rifles, moving through zones most men avoided. To German infantry who had been told to crouch low and trust only steel, watching these men stand tall with nothing but red crosses on their arms felt like madness or frightening confidence. Axis stretcher bearers, particularly in German and Italian units, were often minimally trained. Many were chosen because they couldn't keep up in combat roles. Their job was to retrieve bodies and carry them to improvised aid stations when the guns quieted. It wasn't cowardice, it was doctrine. The front was for fighting, medical care belonged behind it. But American doctrine flipped this on its head. Their medics drilled almost like elite troops. They memorized casualty evacuation routes, practiced night extractions, and were equipped with tools the Axis simply didn't have in similar numbers: plasma, morphine, sterile bandages, splints, and tourniquets. Captured Axis diaries show the quiet frustration. "Their wounded disappear," one soldier wrote. "We hear the cries and then silence because someone always comes for them." In contrast, German soldiers often lay wounded on the field until the battle shifted. It wasn't negligence. It was simply how war had always been fought. The Americans had changed the rules. What the Axis eventually came to fear was not just the skill, but the morale it built. American soldiers went into combat with the unspoken knowledge that if they fell, they wouldn't be alone. Someone would risk everything to get them out. That belief made them fight differently. A German medical officer later observed, "They fight harder because they know pain is not the end. They believe in their doctors the way we believe in our guns." For Axis units, the opposite was true. A wound meant uncertainty, perhaps hours in the mud, perhaps no help at all. It was the kind of fear that lingered in a soldier's chest long before the first shot was fired. That fear, over time, erodes the will to fight. Many Axis prisoners initially dismissed American medical actions as sentimentality, a soft luxury of a wealthy nation. But as the war wore on, the strategic effect became impossible to ignore. Rapid medical response kept units intact, morale high, and experienced fighters in the line. It wasn't softness, it was ruthless efficiency. To Axis commanders, this was infuriating. War, in their doctrine, was supposed to wear down the enemy, yet America had built a machine to keep its fighting men on their feet, even after they'd been struck down. A German captain summarized it bitterly: "They don't lose men the way we do, they refuse to." The psychological gap between the armies widened with every engagement. American soldiers, buoyed by the presence of their medics, advanced with a kind of confidence the Axis found unnerving. The Axis, weighed down by their own doctrine, often fought with the knowledge that a wound might mean abandonment. One Italian infantryman captured in Sicily confessed in disbelief: "They have soldiers who fight, and soldiers who make sure no one dies alone. We have neither." The Americans didn't just bring more guns, they brought hope, and hope on a battlefield is a dangerous thing. As one German officer later admitted after the war, "We thought we were fighting men, we were fighting a system that did not accept death easily." And for the Axis, that realization was far more frightening than any weapon they faced. The first time many Axis soldiers heard the word plasma wasn't in a classroom, but on a battlefield. It came not as a scientific explanation, but as a sight that felt almost supernatural: a soldier pale and fading, a medic opening a glass bottle, a thin tube running into a wounded arm, and then, minutes later, life returning to a face that had already gone gray. For men who'd grown used to watching their comrades bleed out, this felt less like medicine and more like a miracle. What the Axis didn't fully grasp at first was that plasma wasn't just a clever trick at the front. It was the visible tip of an enormous, invisible machine. Thousands of miles away, American civilians were rolling up their sleeves. Blood was being drawn, processed, and transformed into plasma. The Red Cross organized drives that became national rituals. Truckloads of bottled life left cities and towns, crossed oceans, and arrived at battlefields where medics carried them in canvas kits. A German doctor captured in Tunisia said later, almost in awe, "They bring their blood with them, as if every soldier carries a second life in his pack." The Axis could barely imagine such an operation. Their armies were already stretched to provide rations, boots, and ammunition. In German and Italian units, blood transfusions were rare and reserved for hospitals far behind the front. In the Japanese military, they were nearly unheard of. But the Americans had turned blood itself into a weapon of endurance. For Axis observers, the effect of plasma was immediate and deeply unsettling. In many battles, they had seen men hit, grow cold, and die before a doctor could arrive. Blood loss was often a quiet, cruel enemy, yet here were American medics starting transfusions in the mud, under fire within minutes. A German sergeant wounded in Sicily described watching through half-shut eyes as an American medic hung a plasma bottle from a makeshift pole and gently squeezed the tubing to quicken the flow. The soldier beside him had taken a chest wound. "He was as white as chalk," the sergeant said. "I thought he was gone, then his color came back. I couldn't believe it." This was not improvisation. Every medic had been trained to use plasma kits as naturally as a soldier uses a rifle. They carried glass bottles, tubing, and needles wrapped in cloth to protect them during combat. They could start a transfusion on a roadside, in a trench, even in the back of a jeep bouncing through shell craters. What struck Axis intelligence analysts hardest was the scale. How could a country supply plasma across 2 oceans, through convoy routes and jungle airstrips, and still deliver it cold, sterile, and ready to use at the very edge of battle? The answer lay not in the trenches, but in the factories, the laboratories, and the shipping lanes that stretched back to the American homeland. Axis commanders faced constant shortages of food, of ammunition, of medical supplies. Their systems were lean, brittle, efficient in destruction, but weak in care. America, by contrast, wielded abundance as a weapon. It wasn't just about how many bottles of plasma they carried. It was about what those bottles meant, a nation mobilized not just to fight, but to keep its men alive. One captured German medic recalled the first time he saw a severely wounded American survive because of plasma. The man had lost so much blood he could barely breathe. Under Axis conditions, such an injury would have meant certain death within the hour, but the medic watched as an American team stabilized him, administered plasma, and carried him away. Days later, to his astonishment, he saw the same soldier walking. "That," the medic whispered, "was the moment I understood we were fighting more than an army." Plasma changed everything, not only survival rates but morale. American soldiers went into combat with the knowledge that if they were wounded, they might still see home. Axis troops, by contrast, often looked at a wound as a death sentence. The psychological blow grew even heavier when Axis soldiers themselves began receiving plasma as prisoners. Italian and German POWs wrote of being transfused by American medics after being wounded in firefights. To them, it was unimaginable, the enemy pouring his resources into saving the lives of those who had just tried to kill him. One German corporal later told an interrogator, "We thought it was a trick. We thought they'd poison us, but it wasn't a trick. They saved us." The moment stuck. It spread through letters, rumors, whispers in POW camps. The Americans don't let even their enemies bleed out. Plasma was more than a medical tool. It was a message, whispered into the fog of war. We do not surrender our wounded easily. It reminded every American soldier on the front line that the nation stood behind them, bottle by bottle, transfusion by transfusion. And it told the enemy something else, something far more demoralizing. The Axis believed war ground men down, but here was a power that refused to be ground down. Here was an enemy who turned wounds into delays rather than deaths. By 1943, Axis officers could see the numbers on paper. Fewer American soldiers were dying from blood loss. More were returning to duty. Each plasma bottle on the field was worth more than bullets. It represented soldiers reclaimed from death, divisions kept at strength, morale unbroken. A German colonel summed it up grimly in a post-war interview. "We fired at men, but we were fighting against a country that had built an artery from its cities straight to the battlefield. Every man they saved was another we'd have to face again." For most Axis soldiers, surgery was something that happened far away, deep behind the front, if a wounded man lived long enough to get there. The battlefield belonged to guns and blood. Healing, if it came at all, came days later. But when Axis troops first stumbled upon an American field surgical hospital, it felt like stepping into a different war altogether. The tents looked ordinary from a distance, blending into the battered landscape like any other military encampment. But inside, it was another world. Electric lamps burned white against the mud. Tables were lined with sterile instruments wrapped in gauze. Anesthesia tanks hissed softly. Surgeons in rolled-up sleeves moved with a kind of confident rhythm, not the rushed chaos of a battlefield, but the disciplined calm of a hospital. All of this unfolded just a few miles from the fighting. A German infantryman captured near Salerno described the moment he was carried in. "I expected to be thrown in a truck, maybe bleed out on the way to Rome," he said. "Instead, I was on a table before the sun set. I didn't even understand where I was. It was war outside and a hospital inside." To men raised on the harsh efficiency of Axis doctrine, where medical help was often distant or improvised, this felt unreal. The Americans had developed something revolutionary: mobile surgical hospitals, compact, rapidly deployable units that could be set up and torn down in hours. They were built to move with the front line, not trail behind it. Unlike the Axis, which kept most surgical capacity far to the rear, the U.S. Army brought its surgeons forward. Trucks carried collapsible operating tables, generators, sterilizers, lighting, blood plasma, anesthesia, and trained teams who could turn a muddy patch of ground into a functioning hospital almost overnight. For Axis soldiers used to watching men die en route to care, this mobility was shocking. It wasn't mercy alone, it was engineering. One Italian lieutenant remembered watching American trucks roll into a captured orchard. Within hours, canvas walls rose, lights flickered on, and the sound of generators filled the air. Soon, stretchers began arriving. The men on them were pale, bleeding, often broken, but they didn't wait in endless lines. One by one, they were wheeled inside. Surgeons worked through the night. The Axis had mobile aid posts, of course, but not like this. Their forward posts could dress wounds, not open chests. They could bandage, not operate. By the time a badly injured man reached a German or Italian surgical hospital, it was often too late. The Americans had changed the timeline. They were no longer treating survivors, they were creating them. Perhaps the most unnerving part for Axis soldiers was how close these hospitals were to danger. In Italy, artillery fire could be heard clearly from inside the surgical tents. Sometimes, shells whistled overhead while scalpels moved. A German medic captured in 1944 shook his head when describing it. "We never would have operated that close," he said. "They didn't wait for the battlefield to end. They carried the hospital to the battle." This proximity meant minutes instead of hours, and in war, minutes are everything. Inside these mobile hospitals, everything was organized like clockwork. Nurses cleaned wounds with practiced precision. Surgeons performed amputations, repaired arteries, set broken bones. Anesthesia flowed freely. a luxury many Axis soldiers never experienced on the front. Infection rates plummeted compared to what German and Japanese medics could achieve in distant, overburdened facilities. For Axis soldiers, whose comrades often endured excruciating procedures with little more than a cloth to bite on, the sight of wounded men drifting into quiet unconsciousness under anesthesia was hard to believe. It was as if pain itself had been pushed out of the tent. One captured German soldier recalled the night his unit was overrun outside Cassino. A bullet shattered his femur. Under German care, he might have lain for hours before being loaded onto a truck, his fate uncertain. Instead, American medics reached him before dawn. By the next afternoon, he awoke under canvas, his leg bandaged, the worst of the pain gone. "I thought they'd interrogate me," he admitted later. "Instead, they operated." The survival of such men spread through the ranks as rumors and bitter truths. Axis troops realized that while their wounded died en route, American wounded were often back on their feet within weeks. None of this happened by chance. Mobile surgical hospitals required precision logistics. They depended on steady flows of sterile equipment, anesthesia, generators, water, and plasma, all maintained under combat conditions. It was a machine that reflected the larger strength of the American war effort: coordination, abundance, and the refusal to accept unnecessary losses. German officers understood this even if they hated to admit it. Every American soldier saved meant one more fighter to face tomorrow. Every surgical tent erected near the front line was a quiet victory over the natural attrition of war. Captured Axis soldiers often spoke less about battles and more about what they saw behind the lines. They described the glow of surgical lamps at night, the calm efficiency of nurses working under shell fire, the strange feeling of being treated by the enemy as if their lives mattered. For many, this image stayed longer than the memory of gunfire. The Japanese, who fought in remote island jungles where even basic medical care was scarce, were particularly stunned. Their wounded often died in isolation. To see an enemy turning blood-soaked clearings into functioning hospitals within a day was almost beyond comprehension. A Japanese officer later admitted, "We thought we understood war. Then we saw what they did for their wounded. It was not war as we knew it." The battlefield for the Axis had always been a place where death and medicine were separated by distance. The Americans erased that distance. They turned tents into operating theaters and hours into minutes. And that changed everything. Every mobile hospital wasn't just a medical station. It was a message: we do not surrender our wounded easily. For the Axis, that message was as loud as artillery. The difference between life and death on a battlefield is often measured not in hours, but in minutes. And the Axis learned, to their growing unease, that the Americans had built a system to claim those minutes. What began with medics running through gunfire and plasma flowing into veins didn't end at the edge of the battlefield. It stretched beyond it, into a moving, breathing evacuation network that pulled the wounded out of hell with a precision most armies could only dream of. Axis soldiers were used to seeing the wounded linger where they fell. In many cases, evacuation depended on whatever could be found: carts, stretchers, or raw human strength. Even the German army, with its disciplined structure, often moved its wounded slowly, waiting until the front quieted before daring to send help. The Americans didn't wait. Their medics stabilized soldiers on the field and then handed them to modified jeeps, small, fast vehicles stripped of their original role and remade into rolling lifeboats. Steel brackets and stretcher racks were welded onto the sides. A wounded man didn't have to wait for the battle to end. He was whisked away while it was still raging. To Axis eyes, it was jarring. Jeeps they knew as reconnaissance cars became ambulances, bouncing across shell-churned earth with red crosses painted on their sides. It looked reckless. It was, in fact, deliberate. A German private later wrote in a POW diary, "They don't drag their wounded through the mud like we do. They drive them away before the blood even cools." Behind those jeeps waited something bigger. Trucks converted into mobile ambulances stood at collection points just beyond the front. Some carried stretchers stacked in double rows. Others held basic medical equipment, oxygen, and additional plasma. American medics could continue treatment on the move, keeping the wounded alive as they hurtled toward mobile hospitals. By comparison, many Axis soldiers traveled to aid stations in wagons, horse carts, or improvised carriers. The difference wasn't just speed, it was dignity. American wounded were moved like lives to be saved. Axis wounded were moved like burdens to be managed. And soldiers noticed things like that. But perhaps the most shocking part of this chain came from the sky. The United States didn't just drive its wounded out, it flew them. Throughout North Africa, Europe, and the Pacific, aircraft were repurposed as flying ambulances. C-47 transports that once carried paratroopers were fitted with stretcher racks, medical gear, and crews trained to stabilize patients in flight. Nurses and medics tended to men midair, monitoring vital signs as propellers roared outside. To Axis troops, this seemed like fantasy. In their armies, wounded men often never made it past the front lines alive. The idea that a soldier could be wounded in the morning and flown hundreds of miles to a hospital by night felt like a story meant to break morale, but it was real. One German pilot captured in 1943 said with quiet disbelief, "They use planes for the wounded. We use them for bombs." What terrified Axis commanders wasn't just the technology, it was the coordination. A wounded man on the front might be treated by a medic, rushed by jeep to a triage station, stabilized again in a truck, and flown out by nightfall. Each step had a role. Each role was drilled into thousands of soldiers. It was a chain with no weak link. Axis armies, fighting with limited resources and overstretched logistics, couldn't match that. In many cases, even if a soldier survived his wounds, the long and brutal journey to medical care killed him before the surgeons ever touched a scalpel. The Americans didn't accept that outcome. They designed their war around preventing it. This system was about more than movement. It was about relief. Every medic carried small morphine syringes tucked into bandoliers, slim glass tubes with needles attached. A jab to the arm, and agony faded in seconds. Axis soldiers, used to seeing their wounded writhing and screaming, were stunned to see pain silenced so swiftly. A German officer captured near Monte Cassino described watching an American medic kneel beside a man whose leg had been shattered by shrapnel. The man was white, shaking, gasping, he said. The medic whispered something, jabbed a needle, and within moments the pain was gone. It looked like sorcery. Then came the final blow to Axis medical assumptions, penicillin. Until then, infection was one of the most ruthless killers of the war. A wound that didn't kill immediately could easily turn fatal days later. German and Japanese medics did their best with sulfa powders, improvised bandages, and delayed surgeries, but infection took thousands of lives that bullets had only started to claim. The Americans brought something new, mass-produced penicillin. It was carried in field hospitals, on evacuation trucks, even in the pockets of some medics. Soldiers who would have died of septic shock days after a firefight survived. They didn't just survive, many returned to fight. A Japanese sergeant captured in the Pacific shook his head when interrogators asked what had surprised him most about the Americans. Not their planes, he said, their medicine. The result was a psychological shift the Axis could see but not replicate. American soldiers advanced with an assurance their enemies lacked. They knew that if they were hit, the machine would move, the jeeps, the trucks, the planes, the medics, the morphine, the antibiotics. The system would come for them. Axis soldiers, by contrast, often went into combat carrying not just their weapons but the quiet dread of abandonment. Wounds were feared not simply because they hurt, but because they isolated. A wound on the Axis side could mean dying alone in the dirt. What made this system truly powerful was that it was visible to the enemy. Axis soldiers saw the jeeps speeding across open ground. They heard planes lifting off with stretchers inside. They saw men who should have died disappear into the chain and sometimes, days or weeks later, return to the fight. Captured German diaries described it bitterly. They fight without fear because they know death can be postponed. This was more than logistics. It was psychological warfare wrapped in white armbands and red crosses. By late 1944, the Axis command knew what this meant. Attrition, the slow wearing away of an enemy through wounds and death, had always been one of war's most reliable strategies, but the Americans had found a way to weaken it. Every soldier saved meant another rifle on the line. Every stretcher loaded onto a plane meant attrition denied. Every injection of morphine or penicillin meant morale preserved. As a German colonel admitted after the war, we counted their dead. We didn't count the ones they brought back. By the final years of the war, Axis soldiers no longer needed to be told about America's medical machine. They had seen it. They had watched medics charge through gunfire, seen plasma flow in the mud, stared at surgical tents glowing like lanterns in the dark. They had heard the sound of jeeps rushing the wounded away and planes lifting off into the night, carrying men who would live. What they hadn't expected was how much it would hurt them, not their bodies, but their spirit. Traditional warfare was built on predictable math. Armies fought, soldiers fell, wounds thinned the ranks, and morale cracked under the weight of attrition. But America had tilted the scale. They didn't simply count the wounded, they brought them back. A German officer wrote in his diary during the winter of 1944, "We used to measure victory by how many of them we could wound, but wounding an American means nothing now. They come back." And they did. Wounded U.S. soldiers who would have died on an Axis battlefield were returning weeks later to the front lines, stitched, transfused, medicated, and determined. For Axis troops, it was like fighting an enemy with extra lives. The survival gap was staggering. By 1945, the U.S. Army had one of the highest battlefield survival rates in modern history at the time. For every American soldier who fell, many more survived their injuries. German and Japanese soldiers, facing shortages of medicine and limited evacuation, could not match this. A wound for them often meant a slow death. A wound for an American often meant another chance. A German sergeant wounded outside Casino watched, bitterly, as American soldiers hit alongside him were carried away and later returned. "It is as if they do not fear being hurt," he wrote. "They march like men who have made a bargain with death." That belief that being wounded is not the end transformed the battlefield. American soldiers fought with a resilience that shook their enemies. Axis troops could see it in the way they advanced, how they moved under fire, how they did not hesitate. The Axis tried to break American lines with shock, artillery, and attrition, but behind every rifleman stood an invisible army of medics, surgeons, pilots, and logisticians. Even when American units took heavy casualties, the heart of their force didn't crumble. Men returned. Hope was not buried with the wounded. It traveled with them, from trench to jeep, jeep to plane, plane to hospital. One Japanese lieutenant, captured after the battle for Leyte, said quietly, "We were not fighting men. We were fighting their system. It did not allow them to fear death the way we did." Among Axis soldiers, this realization spread like smoke. Letters and diary entries revealed it in raw language, sometimes bitter, sometimes reverent, sometimes simply resigned. "We bleed, they heal. German infantrymen, Italy. Their wounded vanish and then they reappear. Italian officer, Sicily. Even death seems slower with them. Japanese soldier, Luzon." These weren't just observations. They were acknowledgments of something more devastating than artillery, the enemy's refusal to let its own men die quietly. For many Axis troops, it wasn't the technology that broke their morale, it was the humanity. They had been taught to see the enemy as a machine, ruthless, cold, focused, but the Americans brought something else to the war, compassion weaponized through organization. Axis POWs who received American medical care after being captured often struggled to reconcile it with their training. They had expected neglect, maybe cruelty. Instead, they received plasma, bandages, and surgery from the enemy. That kind of mercy, quiet, clinical, unhesitating, sank deeper than any bullet. It whispered something they could not ignore. You are fighting a nation that values life differently. By the end of the war, Axis planners understood that the American medical system had done more than save lives. It had undermined one of the oldest weapons in war, fear. Fear of bleeding out in the mud. Fear of pain that never ends. Fear of being forgotten. For American soldiers, those fears were tempered by a system built to catch them when they fell. For Axis soldiers, those fears lingered with every step toward the front. A German colonel admitted after the war, "We counted their wounded as victories. We were wrong. A wounded American is not a lost soldier." The battlefield medicine of the United States during World War II was more than a logistical triumph. It was a strategic revolution. It reshaped how armies fought, how soldiers endured, and how wars were measured. Every medic sprinting under fire, every plasma bottle hanging from a branch, every surgeon working under artillery, every plane lifting off into the night, all of it formed a single message: we do not give up our own. For Axis soldiers raised on doctrines of endurance and sacrifice, this was a kind of warfare they were not prepared for. They had expected to fight flesh and blood. What they encountered was an idea, one that treated every soldier's survival as part of the fight. When the war ended, the weapons were counted, the tanks were measured, the maps were redrawn, but beneath the steel and the smoke was a quieter victory. America had not just fought the Axis. It had fought death itself, and won far more often than anyone thought possible. For Axis survivors, the memory of that fight never faded. It wasn't just the sound of American guns they remembered. It was the sight of medics rushing through fire. The glow of surgical lamps, the hum of planes lifting the wounded away. The enemy hadn't only marched with weapons, it had marched with lifelines.